the Attorney General. Joho assumed the Cabinet Secretary role from Salim Vuria, who was reassigned to the Trade and Industry docket. Brian Amoai, K24. Now, the Okoa Uchumi campaign has called for accountability in the country's debt management, saying the government had engaged in one-ton borrowing without corresponding benefits to Kenyans. Now, the civil society group held a citizens' assembly in Nairobi today, where the Office of the Comptroller of Budget warned that domestic debt, which attracts high-rate interest, will soon become a burden too heavy for Kenyans to bear. Muriel Adhiambo reports.
The withdrawal of the 2024 finance bill has added a revenue deficit of 364 billion shillings to the country's budget, which President William Ruto says will force Kenya to borrow 1 trillion shillings this financial year. But a report released by Auditor General Nancy Gathungu in June showed that the government could not account for 1.1 trillion shillings borrowed between the year 2010 and 2021. The Law Society of Kenya now wants civil society groups to play a greater role in budget making to enhance accountability.
LSK should have also the ability to formally engage with international financial institutions like IMF and World Bank on legal matters concerning fiscal policies. That's the only way that we can also ask hard questions to these international bodies that continue to raise the curtain or turn a blind eye towards what is happening in the nation.
The Okoa Uchumi campaign held a public assembly in Nairobi today, where the Office of the Comptroller of Budget flagged the increasing levels of domestic debt, which stand at 5.41 trillion, saying Kenya risks falling into debt distress. The central bank reports that Kenya has so far borrowed 10.27 trillion shillings, which is equivalent to 70% of the country's GDP. In July, global rating agency Moody's downgraded Kenya's credit rating, putting the country in poor standing and indicating a very high credit risk.
If you look at those domestic borrowings, 534.2 is interest which has been paid to service the domestic debt. Why? What is the rate of domestic debt interest rate which are charged in the country? The treasury bills, the treasury bonds are at around 17–18%.
Civil society groups are now calling for an urgent and publicized debt audit and the prosecution of those implicated in poor fiscal management.
In Kenya, what happens whenever there is a deficit? Rarely do we shrink it. Through supplementary budget, the deficit increases.
Because despite the bloodshed that we had seen in the last 2 months, despite the demands that had been made by Kenyans about the need to clean up the public sector, the president unashamedly gave us a person who was being actively investigated for several cases in regard to corruption.
And the prosecution of those implicated in poor management of public funds. Muriel Adhiambo, K24 TV, Nairobi.
Now, away from that, youth are encouraged to channel their bravery, they showed during the Gen Z demonstrations into demanding accountability from President Ruto's administration. Martha Karua, leader of NARC Kenya Party, has urged Kenyans to remain vigilant and prevent the reintroduction of contested provisions from the rejected 2024 finance bill. Karua emphasized these points as she positioned herself as the new leader of the opposition against the current government. Mariam Jahid reports.
The leader of the NARC Kenya Party, Martha Karua, has expressed concerns over potential violations of rights and freedom under President William Ruto's administration.
You remember his famous statement during his swearing in, "When I put the Bible down." It appears it's not only the Bible he put down, it's also the Constitution that he cast aside.
Karua has urged the youth to persist in holding leaders accountable.
Some aspects of the rejected bill, such as the fuel levy and other issues that this tone-deaf regime is now talking of returning. As Kenyans, we must not accept this and we must continue to question. And this,
while focusing on police brutality against the Gen Z youth, Karua is now calling for accountability and legal action against the officers involved.
we are not seeing any cooperation by the law enforcement agencies, any cooperation from the Ruto regime to establish how many died, to make reparations, to establish the whereabouts of the missing and bring closure to their families. Here today to remind Ruto and his regime that we are waiting for officers who are known, whose faces were widely circulated in the media. Some even their false numbers were circulated. When will they be brought to account?
She plans to present a case to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the United Nations.
We will submit this statement and more details as a formal complaint to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to the UN Commission on Human Rights, and all other relevant organizations.
Simultaneously, Francis Owino, president of Bunge la Mwananchi, has filed a petition with the East African Court seeking accountability from the Kenya Kwanza administration for the deaths and injuries during the protest.
A petition has been filed accusing the government of Kenya of committing crimes against humanity. And they established that the Republic of Kenya has a case to answer with regards to the heinous crimes perpetrated during 2 state-sponsored operations.
Following Raila Odinga's announcement of his departure from Kenya politics, Karua has declared her intention to lead the opposition against the current government.
I'm not going to be very active in Kenyan politics henceforth, as I continue now to focus my attention on the continental campaign.
Our being in the opposition is not predicated on the presence or absence of our brother. It is a duty we take up seriously. We are not a party in government, we are opposition.
Mother Karua's appeal to the youth could signal the start of a new opposition movement.
The country belongs to us, not to the ruling elite.
Mariam Jahid, K24, Nairobi.
All right, that story by Mariam Jahid takes us to our first break here on K24 Evening Edition. It is 17 minutes past the hour. We'll be back in a few.
Cheza kama wewe na cheza sita. Ushinde hadi mara 5,000 ya beti yako teke teke. Yes!